Hi everyone, this is Grant, aka Velocity, and in today's video I'm going to present a super duper scientific study on diversity and power in VGC formats. Now, this all started a few days ago when I tweeted this. I said, maybe it's a hot take, but Regulation F, the current VGC format, is my least favorite format so far in Scarlet and Violet. I think it's because there are too many powerful teams that play unconventionally. It's difficult to cover for all of Priority Spam, Psy Spam, Blood Moon Ursaluna, Dondozo, etc. And there's no standard balance team to center the format. Now, this naturally got a lot of pushback, and that's okay. A lot of people were saying that they really enjoyed the amount of diversity in this format. There are so many archetypes out there, and people really like to test out different archetypes, use different archetypes, and try to build a team that can be all of these different things. And that's totally fair. Everyone has a different opinion on every format. This was just my personal opinion. I said it's just my least favorite. But it got me thinking a bit more about what I meant by too many powerful teams. Here's a tweet from Justin Karras. Now, I don't know what Justin's opinion on the format is. I don't want to speak for him in terms of his opinion, but this is just a tweet he put out where he listed some of the powerful archetypes. There's Entei Chen Pao 6, which won Portland Regionals. There's Farigarath Blood Moon Ursaluna, Iron Crown Psy Spam, Hard Trick Room, Dondozo, Archaludon Rain, Riley's Team, Tailwind Hyper Offense, and Glamora Stuff, which is a variant of Tailwind Hyper Offense. To me, this seems like a very large amount of powerful archetypes. And as I was looking through the results of Limitless tournaments, I saw a lot of powerful archetypes in the top cut. Here's perhaps the most extreme example. This is from a 200-person tournament. In first place, there's Archaludon Rain. Then we have Mouseape Psy Spam. Then we have Chenpao Dragapult Trick Room. We have Dondozo. We have Regidrago Balance. Brugzish Corviknight Balance. Torn Archaludon Hyper Offense. Spectrier Thunderous Gouging Fire Balance. And then just outside of top cut, there's Iron Jugulus Cleavor Psy Spam. So again, as I'm looking through these results, it seems like there's a very large diversity in the amount of powerful archetypes. And so I released this tweet clarifying what I meant. First of all, I don't even use balanced teams myself. I've been using a Regidrago team for almost 6 months now at nearly every regional, and Regidrago is certainly not a balanced meta pick. And I don't want a format to have one single team. I think one of the things that makes VGC a really fun game is the creativity that's allowed in team building. I think diverse formats with a low power level are healthy, but my problem with Regulation F is that the diversity is high and the power level is high. There are a large number of very powerful archetypes. And so this got me thinking, is this actually true? Does Regulation F actually have both high power and high diversity relative to other formats? And if so, by how much? Now, just as a caveat, Pokemon is a highly complex game, and all of the intricacies can't neatly be captured on the two axes of power and diversity. It's just that people often use these terms when they're comparing formats to one another, and I thought it'd be interesting just to see how all the formats fall along these two axes. So the first thing we need to do is collect data. So I'm looking at the VGC formats from 2014 to 2024. This is basically the modern era of VGC. And I'm only looking at Ultra Series in 19 and Series 12 in 22. But I am looking at every format in Scarlet and Violet. This is just to avoid cluttering up the analysis, as Ultra Series and Series 12 were the formats of the World Championships in those years respectively. I'm looking at the top 8 teams of the 3 most major events in a format. This is to give a representative snapshot of the format. I think if a team made top 8 at one of these major events, then it deserved to be considered a meta threat. And if it didn't, then, maybe there was something holding it back. It could still be a good team, but it wasn't one of the most major teams that, generally goes on to shape the meta. I'm defining the major events in order of Worlds, Internationals and Nationals, then Regionals, then Online, with attendance as a tiebreaker. So the most major events in most formats are Worlds, NAIC, and EUIC, but some formats don't have those events. So for example, Regulation F so far has Portland Regionals, Charlotte Regionals, and a very large online tournament. One may argue that we're not making a fair comparison since different formats are given different amounts of time to develop, but I argue that a format is what a format is, and the metagame is what the tournaments are. If a format only had a few events to develop, then that's what people played, and that's what the format was. And so taking the top 8 teams of the 3 most major events gives us 24 teams and 144 Pokemon in each sample. So each sample actually has a good amount of Pokemon to compare with the other formats. To measure diversity, I'm using what's called the Shannon Index. Now, I'm an astrophysicist by training, not a biologist, and so some of you may know a lot more about this than I do. But basically, the Shannon Index is used in biology to measure both the quantity of unique species in a population and the proportion of each species within the population. So it gives you some information about how many different kinds of Pokemon there are in the sample and how well represented those Pokemon are. It's given by the sum over all the species of Pokemon in the sample of the proportion of that species times the natural log of that proportion. And a higher Shannon Index means that a sample is more diverse. To illustrate, here are 2 top 4s from Worlds 2015 and Worlds 2014. And I think we can all agree on which of these is more diverse. In 2015, the top cut was dominated by this chalk core of Cresselia, Heatran, Amoonguss, Landorus, Kangaskhan, and Thundurus, and slight variants thereof. And 2014 was a lot more diverse. It most famously had a Pachirisu, but you can see that there are a number of other niche picks. And if we compute the Shannon indices, we find 2.19 for Worlds 2015 and 3.45 for Worlds 2014. And so indeed the Shannon Index reproduces what we expect, which is that 2014 was more diverse than 2015, at least in the top 4. And so what we'll do is we'll compute the Shannon Index for the 24 teams in each sample to get a sense of how diverse that format was. Measuring the power level is a bit simpler. I'm just taking the average base stat total of all the Pokemon in the sample, and I'm only averaging the 5 highest stats, since basically every Pokemon just uses one of its attacking stats. Of course there are mixed attackers, but the number of those is so small that it doesn't really affect the results. And looking at the same samples that we saw in the previous slide, we can see that Worlds 2015 has a higher power level than Worlds 2014, and that's to be expected. 2014 was a regional dex format, and in 2015 there were new, more powerful legendaries that were allowed in play, and we see those in the top cut. To get the base stats of all the Pokemon, I'm using what's called PyPokédex, and I'll link that in the description below. Basically, it's a Python package where you can pull up the base stats along with other information for every Pokemon. And I'm including the base stats of Mega Evolutions and Primal Evolutions when those are relevant. And here are the results. So this is almost every VGC format over the past 10 years plotted in terms of diversity and power. And I've put a sample Pokemon for each format just to guide you as to which format it is. And immediately there are some features that pop out. So first, there's an anti-correlation, generally speaking, between diversity and power. It seems that formats with higher power have low diversity, and this is unsurprising. Formats centralize around powerful Pokemon, and they centralize around the counters to those powerful Pokemon. I think it's interesting to just look at the Scarlet and Violet formats. So starting here with Regulation A, this was the Paldea Regional Dex format. This was a low power level, high diversity format, in which most of the new Pokemon had some level of viability. Then in Regulation B, the Paradox Pokemon get introduced. These were more powerful, somewhat centralizing Pokemon, and so the format became less diverse and had a higher power level. Then in Regulation C, we got the Ruin Legendaries, Chi-Yu, Chen-Pao, Ting-Lu, and Wo-Chen, and these allowed for more centralizing play with cores like Chi-Yu Fluttermane and Chen-Pao Dragonite, and so the format got much less diverse and more powerful. Then in Regulation D, we got new legendaries allowed, most notably Urshifu, but also Pokemon like Landorus and Tornadus. And this made the metagame even more powerful and more centralized. Then in Regulation E, we got new Pokemon like Ogerpon and Ursaluna Blood Moon, and we got some returning Pokemon like Alolan Ninetales. And these Pokemon aren't necessarily more powerful. They're just they just allow for more diversity in team building, and so that's why we sort of move horizontal on this plot. There's not really a change in power. There's just a higher diversity. And likewise in Regulation F, we got a lot more new Pokemon like Raging Bolt and Walking Wake and Gouging Fire, Iron Crown, and we got some older Pokemon returning like Latias and Entei. And again, these Pokemon are not really more powerful. They just add to the amount of Pokemon that you can use in the format. Now I'll return to the plot with all the formats and divide it into quadrants. I haven't drawn the lines exactly halfway on the plot, but that's for a few reasons. So the first is that powerful Pokemon in powerful formats tend to have an even higher power level than the average of their base stats. So what I mean is that a lot of these Pokemon have min-maxed stats, so they're very offensive and not really defensive. And they often have abilities like Sword of Ruin, Intrepid Sword, Unseen Fist that inflates their power level, again, more so than is captured in their stats. And so that's why I've drawn the line here, is that Pokemon above this line tend to have some of these qualities. And I've drawn the diversity line here. I think this is a fair place where most people would draw it. People generally consider 2015 not a very diverse format, whereas 2017 is. But these lines are mostly just meant to be a guide as to where these formats generally fall. Of course, this is a spectrum on both axes. And so I'll talk a bit about each of these quadrants. I'll start in the bottom left. So there are no formats that have both low diversity and low power. And I think people would generally agree that such a format would be uninteresting to play, uninteresting to watch, and Pokemon doesn't really have an incentive to make a VGC format like this. It wouldn't really be good advertising, at least in my opinion, to have a format with low diversity and low power. Moving to the bottom right, so these are formats with high diversity but low power, and these tend to be regional dex formats in which a lot of newer Pokemon are highlighted that aren't yet outclassed by Pokemon with higher stats. And I find these formats to be somewhat challenging to team build into because there are just so many different Pokemon that you have to consider when you're building a team. But in battles, the low power level generally gives you more wiggle room to outmaneuver your opponent. The battles take longer and you're not being, immediately threatened with KOs. So you have more time to gradually outplay your opponent in these formats. Moving to the top left, we have some of the more controversial formats. So these are those with low diversity and high power. And this includes the GS Cup formats with restricted legendaries like Groudon and Rayquaza, but also some recent formats such as Regulation D that famously had Tornadus Urshifu. And these formats tend not to be fan favorites because fans generally don't want to see matches between similar teams, especially those with very powerful Pokemon. I think players are divided on whether they like these formats. These are my personal favorites. I like to really have a limited list of threats and really memorize my matchups into those threats. These formats reward understanding what the central offensive pieces are on your team and how those interact with the offensive pieces on your opponent's team. But a lot of players don't like these formats because the battles go very quickly, and so there's not a lot of wiggle room to outmaneuver your opponent if you have a bad matchup or a bad lead. But I will say that these formats do reward creativity in different ways. So they don't necessarily reward species diversity, although they can, but they really reward small changes in things like EV spreads and movesets that can give you very subtle advantages into the matchups that you'll be playing. And finally, we move on to the last quadrant, and that's formats with high diversity and high power. And indeed, Regulation F lives here, along with 2018, which is even more diverse and powerful by our metrics. Regulation F is not, really an outlier by any means. It's not an extreme case, but it is more powerful than a lot of formats and more diverse than a lot of formats. And it lives in this really interesting region of this parameter space. Now, I mentioned I'm not really a fan of Regulation F, and that's because I feel like the high diversity makes it difficult to cover all of your options in team building, and the high power makes it difficult to outplay your opponent if you find yourself in a bad matchup or with a bad lead. And so I feel like a lot of games come down to matchup and lead roulette. With that said, I think these formats do reward flexible team building. So players who are good team builders and can cover a lot of threats tend to be successful. And I think players who are good at making meta calls at any given time and really recognizing what will stand out above all the other archetypes, I feel like those players can be rewarded too. And I do see the appeal in these formats. I think, it is exciting to see a lot of different teams doing well and seeing a lot of different offensive pieces interacting with each other. There's a lot of different tensions at play, and I think that's really exciting. And so with all that said, I just want to quickly recap. I thought that this was a really fun exercise to do, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Perhaps the result isn't very surprising that there's a general anti-correlation between diversity and power in VGC formats, but I thought it was cool to see that borne out in the data. Regulation F is not really an outlier, but it does have a high diversity and high power with respect to most other formats. And so if you like formats like this, it's pretty cool that the current format lives in this interesting region of the parameter space. And out of the other formats I looked at, 2018 is the only one that is sort of comparable. And Pokemon is more complex than what can be captured on two axes, but diversity and power, I think, do provide a useful framework for understanding what skills a format may reward, whether that's memorizing matchups into just a few teams, or gradually positioning against your opponent, or flexible team building. And so, finally, I just want to give quick thanks to my friends Andrew Whitman and Adit Selvaraj for offering some tips on this analysis. I'd be interested to hear if you have any ideas for extending this analysis or any thoughts on diversity and power in VGC formats. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. If you're interested, follow me on Twitter at VelocityVGC. Thanks for watching.